Hey everyone, welcome to your own personal deep dive. And today we're going to crack open one of the most controversial and enduring works of political philosophy. And you know this one.
I do.
It's Machiavelli's The Prince.
Mhm.
And you've shared some excerpts from the book itself and some background from a modern translation's introduction.
Right.
So I am so ready to get into this and go beyond the surface.
Well, that's exactly what makes The Prince so fascinating. It's
Yeah.
it's not just some sort of abstract treatise on like ideal governance. It gets down to the nitty-gritty of power, and it offers advice that's shockingly pragmatic and surprisingly relevant
Yeah.
even, centuries later.
Okay, so to really unpack this, let's start with Machiavelli himself. Who was this guy and what kind of world shaped his thinking?
So Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat, and he was living through this really intense period of upheaval in Italy
Yeah.
in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And imagine Italy not as like a unified country like we know it today, but just this like tangled web of city-states and duchies and papal states all kind of vying for dominance.
Oh, so a recipe for conflict, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And Machiavelli, he experienced this firsthand. So he actually served in the Florentine government only to be imprisoned and exiled when the Medici family, seized power.
Wow.
And he actually wrote The Prince during this exile.
That's
So
interesting.
maybe as a way to regain favor with the Medici.
So he was writing from a place of real-world experience,
Yes.
not just theoretical musings. Did this color the advice that he gave in The Prince?
Undoubtedly, and here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Machiavelli actually had this fascinating nightly ritual. He describes it himself. He wrote, "When evening comes, I return home and go into my study. On the threshold, I strip off my muddy everyday clothes, put on the robes of court and palace, and in this graver dress I enter the antique courts of the ancients and am welcomed by them, and there I taste the food that alone is mine, and for which I was born. And there I make bold to speak to them and ask the motives of their actions, and they, in their humanity, reply to me."
That's quite a visual, like to step out of his everyday reality and immerse himself in the minds of these ancient leaders
Yeah,
every night, almost like a time traveler.
precisely. And he goes on to say, that for 4 hours he would forget all his troubles and anxieties about poverty and even death. So for Machiavelli, understanding power wasn't just an intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
It was this deeply personal quest.
Okay, so we have Machiavelli, a man steeped in the realities of power, writing this handbook for rulers. Let's get to the heart of The Prince. What's the core message that made it so controversial?
The core message is pretty stark.
Oh.
In the realm of politics, the ends justify the means. Machiavelli argues that a ruler's primary goal is to acquire and maintain power. And to achieve this, they must be willing to act in ways that, might be considered unethical
Right.
in ordinary life.
You're talking about the ideas that earned him the label Machiavellian, like deception, manipulation, even violence. This is where the book gets really uncomfortable, right?
It does, but it's important to understand that Machiavelli was writing for rulers, not private citizens.
Okay.
He believed that they operated under this different set of rules, as he puts it. There is such a gap between how one lives and how one should live that he who neglects what is actually done for what should be done learns the way to self-destruction rather than self-preservation.
So he's saying idealism has no place
Yes.
in this brutal game of politics.
That's the heart of it. And Machiavelli goes even further, stating that in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, where there is no recourse to justice, the end is all that counts.
Wow.
He knew that this would be controversial, but he believed that it was the reality of power.
Okay, so he sets the stage with this pretty radical idea that the ends justify this means for a ruler. But then he gets into specifics,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
What are some of the key principles that Machiavelli lays out in The Prince?
He covers a lot of ground,
Yeah.
but one of his most infamous principles is that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both.
Right.
Machiavelli believed that fear, particularly the fear of punishment, was a far more reliable tool for maintaining control than like love or loyalty.
Okay.
People are fickle, he argues, prone to changing their allegiances based on self-interest. But fear is constant. It breeds obedience and prevents uprisings.
This seems to go against everything we're taught about good leadership, right? Like,
Yeah.
aren't leaders supposed to inspire and motivate through positive means?
In an ideal world, perhaps, but Machiavelli was looking at the world as it was not as it should be.
Right.
He believed that a ruler who relied solely on love or popularity was building their power on very shaky ground.
To illustrate this point, he brings up the example of Cesar Borgia, right?
Right.
A figure who was both admired and reviled for
I-
his ruthlessness.
Exactly. Borgia was a highly effective leader, and he built a powerful state in central Italy through this combination of military skills, strategic alliances, and yes, ruthless elimination of
Yeah.
his rivals.
He didn't shy away from violence when he deemed it necessary. This seems to embody that better to be feared principle.
Yes.
But wasn't Borgia also known for his patronage of the arts? He even employed Leonardo da Vinci as his military engineer.
That's a crucial point. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for mindless brutality.
Right.
He saw Borgia's ruthlessness as this calculated strategy for
Yeah.
achieving stability and order, and
Yeah.
the stability in Machiavelli's view created the conditions for progress.
So there's nuance to this idea of fear.
Yes.
It's not just about being a tyrant. It's about understanding how to wield power effectively sometimes through unpleasant means to achieve a greater goal.
Precisely, and it's this kind of nuanced analysis.
Yeah.
That makes the Prince so compelling. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power and leadership, and it challenges our assumptions about what it takes to succeed in a world where the stakes are so high.
Totally. So we've got this fascinating and unsettling picture of Cesare Borgia, right? A figure who embodies the complexities of Machiavelli's ideas.
Right.
What other key principles does Machiavelli emphasize in The Prince?
Well, another critical principle revolves around military power.
Okay.
Machiavelli vehemently argues that our ruler must have their own independent army. He was deeply skeptical of mercenaries
Okay.
and auxiliary forces like troops borrowed from allies.
He really had it out for mercenaries, didn't he? I remember reading a passage where he describes them in a rather colorful way.
Oh, you're right. He calls them ambitious, undisciplined, disloyal, cowardly with enemies,
Wow.
and more interested in looting than actually fighting.
Wow.
Basically, he saw them as unreliable and ultimately self-serving. Their loyalty was to their paychecks, not to the ruler they served.
So in his view, a ruler who relies on mercenaries is essentially building their power on sand. It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. Machiavelli believed that true power stemmed from having a force that was loyal and dedicated solely to the ruler and the state.
Okay.
And this speaks to a broader theme in The Prince, this idea of self-reliance.
Right.
A ruler can't afford to depend on the whims or interests of others.
It's about controlling the means of force, not being beholden to those who control it. But in today's world where nations form alliances and share military resources, does Machiavelli's view on mercenaries still hold up?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
While the context has certainly changed, I think the underlying principle remains relevant.
Okay.
Think about it. Even in the modern world, nations prioritize their own interests above all else.
Right.
Alliances can shift, treaties can be broken, and ultimately a nation's security rests on its ability to defend itself.
So while the form of military power may have evolved that need for a ruler, or in today's terms, a nation state, to be self-reliant in matters of defense is still very much alive.
Absolutely.
What else does Machiavelli highlight as crucial for a ruler?
Well, another key principle is the need to adapt to changing circumstances.
Okay.
Machiavelli believed that fortune or luck played a significant role in human affairs.
Okay.
However, he didn't see it as something to be passively accepted.
Okay.
He famously compared fortune to a woman arguing that sometimes you have to be bold and assertive to win her favor.
He had some pretty strong opinions about women and fortune, didn't he?
He did.
But I could see how that metaphor would resonate with his audience.
Right.
You can't just sit back and wait for good luck to strike. You have to seize opportunities and be willing to adapt.
Absolutely. And this is where his advice goes beyond simply acquiring power.
Okay.
It's about maintaining it
Yeah.
in a world that is constantly in flux.
Yeah.
A ruler who clings rigidly to outdated methods or fails to recognize, changing tides is doomed to fail.
This resonates even in fields outside of politics, doesn't it? Like businesses, organizations, even individuals. We all have to be adaptable to survive and thrive in a constantly evolving world.
Exactly. Machiavelli was this keen observer of human nature and the dynamics of power.
Yeah.
While his context was 16th century Italy, his insights into the importance of adaptability strategy and understanding human motivations have a timeless quality.
Okay, so we've delved into some of the core principles of The Prince. The ends justify the means, better to be feared than loved, the importance of a ruler's own army, and the need to adapt to changing circumstances. This book has obviously sparked a lot of debate and controversy over the centuries. How was Machiavelli received in his own time, and how has his reputation evolved?
Well, The Prince wasn't exactly an instant bestseller.
Okay.
It actually circulated in manuscript form for years before it was officially published.
Wow.
In 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death.
Interesting.
This suggests that even then, its contents were considered too sensitive or controversial for
Yes.
widespread dissemination.
That makes sense. It's a book that challenges conventional morality and offers advice that could be easily misconstrued
Right.
or used for nefarious purposes.
Mhm.
It's not exactly light reading.
No.
So how did perceptions of Machiavelli and his work change over time?
His legacy is complex and fascinating during the Elizabethan and Jacobean era in England.
Okay.
Think Shakespeare and Marlowe Machiavelli became a sort of stock villain
Okay.
in plays.
Oh, wow.
He was depicted as the embodiment of treachery and evil,
Right.
a cunning manipulator whispering wicked advice in the ears of power-hungry rulers.
So the term Machiavellian as an insult has deep roots.
It does.
It speaks to this enduring image of him as a master of deceit and
Right.
political manipulation.
Exactly. It's remarkable how his name became shorthand for a certain type of ruthless, amoral political behavior.
Yeah.
And this negative perception persisted for centuries.
Wow.
But more recently, scholars have attempted to reevaluate Machiavelli,
Okay.
arguing that he was not necessarily advocating for evil, but rather offering this realistic assessment of how power operates in the real world.
So a more nuanced view of Machiavelli as a political scientist, a keen observer of human behavior, rather than a sinister mastermind plotting world domination.
Precisely, this view sees him as a pragmatist who stripped away the romanticized notions of leadership and exposed the often unpleasant realities of power struggles. And there's a quote from Sir Francis Bacon that captures this idea perfectly.
Cool.
He wrote, "We are much beholden to Machiavelli and writers of that kind who openly and unfeignedly declare or describe what men do and not what they ought to do."
He's being praised for his honesty, for presenting a clear-eyed view of politics
Yes.
without sugarcoating the reality.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes The Prince such an enduring work.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the systems of power that shape our world.
Right.
It's a book that continues to provoke debate and challenge our assumptions,
Totally.
even centuries after it was written.
And, for our listener, what's so striking about The Prince is that while it was written for rulers, it offers insights that are relevant to anyone who wants to understand how power operates,
Right.
whether in politics, business, or even personal relationships.
I couldn't agree more. While the context may have changed the core principles of understanding human nature, adapting to circumstances, and recognizing the dynamics of power remain incredibly relevant.
Machiavelli forces us to ask ourselves difficult questions
Yeah.
about the nature of leadership, the role of ethics in decision-making, and the compromises we might be willing to make in the pursuit of our goals.
It's not always a comfortable exercise,
Right.
but it's an incredibly valuable one, and that's perhaps the greatest legacy of The Prince.
Yeah.
It encourages us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to engage with the world in a more informed and strategic way.
As we've been discussing Machiavelli and the Prince, one thing that's really struck me is how he manages to be both cynical and insightful about human nature. He doesn't shy away from the darker aspects of ambition and self-interest, but he also recognizes the power of human ingenuity and adaptability.
That's a great observation. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty for its own sake.
Right.
He was simply acknowledging that humans are complex creatures capable of both great and terrible things, and for a ruler to be successful, they must understand this duality,
Yeah.
this capacity for both virtue and vice.
It's like he's saying, don't be naive about how people operate,
Yes.
especially when power is involved. We can see this in his discussion of how a ruler should cultivate a public image. He advises them to appear compassionate, trustworthy, and pious, even if those qualities don't necessarily reflect their true nature.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the power of perception.
Yeah.
Machiavelli recognized that in politics, appearances matter.
Right.
A ruler can't afford to be seen as weak or indecisive.
Right.
They need to project an image of strength and capability,
Yeah.
even if it means engaging in a bit of carefully crafted deception.
It's a fascinating insight into the theatrical nature of leadership, and it's something we see play out even today in the age of social media and carefully curated public personas.
Absolutely. The tools in the stage may have changed, but the underlying principle remains the same.
Right.
Perception shapes reality.
Hmm.
And those who understand how to manipulate perception wield a very powerful advantage.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you, and for you listening.
Yeah.
Machiavelli wrote The Prince over 500 years ago, in a world of kingdoms and principalities. Do you think his advice is still relevant today, in our world of nation-states and global politics?
Hmm.
Or has the nature of power fundamentally changed?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And I think the answer is both yes and no.
Yeah, okay.
The specific tactics Machiavelli outlined might not always translate directly to the complexities of our modern world. You know, we have different systems of governance, different technologies, different ethical considerations.
So it's not a one-to-one translation.
Right.
We can't just take his advice verbatim and apply it to the 21st century.
Exactly, but the underlying principles, the core insights into human nature and the dynamics of power,
Yeah?
those are timeless understanding how to wield influence, how to strategize, how to adapt to changing circumstances. These are skills that are as valuable today as they were in Machiavelli's time.
It's about understanding the mindset, the approach to power,
Yes.
rather than trying to replicate specific actions.
Precisely, if Machiavelli were alive today, he might be writing a very different kind of guide,
Right.
tailored to the nuances of modern geopolitics, the influence of technology, and the evolving landscape of global power.
So for our listener, here's something to ponder.
Okay.
Imagine Machiavelli in the 21st century. What kind of advice would he give to a modern leader navigating the complexities of our interconnected world?
Right.
What new challenges and opportunities would he address?
It's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is.
And I think it speaks to the enduring power of Machiavelli's work that it continues to spark these kinds of questions centuries after it was written.
It's a testament to his ability to cut through the noise and get to the heart of what drives human behavior, especially in the realm of power.
Yeah,
Well, I think this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of Machiavelli and the Prince.
it has.
We've explored his life, his context, the controversial principles he laid out, and the enduring legacy of his work.
It's been a pleasure unpacking these complex ideas with you.
Likewise, and for you listening, if you're intrigued by Machiavelli's ideas and want to explore further, we've included some excellent resources in the show notes, including additional readings on Machiavelli and the Italian Renaissance. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.